Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Talking Landscape Photography, episode 22, I believe. I remember a long time ago, Licky and I said, let's do 6 episodes. And I think we've cracked that one out of the park, and we're not going to be stopping anytime soon. So I'm actually very proud to have one of my neighbors, actually. I can literally walk to Grant's house in about 2 minutes. And I can walk to Rob Blaker's house on the other direction in about 2 minutes as well. So I'm in a pretty special sort of neighborhood, really, for what I would consider as legendary photographers and people I've looked up to through my career. And I've been watching and following Grant's work for more than 2 decades now, and he's sort of set the standard, I think, for alpine photography and travel photography in Tasmania, but also in the world, and huge amount of time in the Himalayas in particular. And I've never seen anyone wear shorts in the kind of conditions that he wears shorts in my life. I think he's got snow in his blood, is my point. And because some people just have that capacity, that affinity, that love, that's joy. And I would say the kind of steel and inner resolve that pushes them into mountaineering realms and into extreme places around the world. And the kind of places that most of us would be very uncomfortable and quite challenged by is Grant's sort of playground. And he's been sort of out in the cold, snowy areas. He knows how to read this landscape as much as anyone ever has in Tasmania. I think he's probably walked as much of this land as anyone ever has in the world, as far as I know. In fact, it's kind of been his job to do that as well for a long period of time. So we're really happy to have Grant on the show tonight, and he's got a good selection for us tonight of 2 kind of sections. The first one being a wider, bigger picture, sort of global snow and mountaineering and travel kind of set. And then we're going to wrap up and finish on what we're all very excited by at the moment. And I'm just about to pre-order, and I think Lukey already has, and
Yep,
Nick
definitely
probably has, of Grant's new book, which is an incredible body of work, a very unique body of work on snow and winter-based images in Tasmania. And we'll be touching base on why that's so unique, partly because of the way the world's heading environmentally and climate-wise. It's likely to be a body of work that will never be repeated again. So, Nick, have you got anything you want to add to intro Grant or Luke?
Yeah, absolutely. Welcome, Grant, and welcome everyone. Very excited about this episode because, like Paul and many photographers in Tasmania and around Australia, I've been following Grant's work for a long time, and there's one. There are lots of elements that I really like, but Grant is a person that truly takes his wilderness photography to new heights and another level by his commitment and his determination to get out there in conditions that most of us wouldn't even dream about walking through. And not only is he out there doing that, he's bringing back some incredible compositions of alpine Tasmania in particular, and all around the world. But very excited to see what he's got to show us today, as I'm sure many of the people viewing have. He's one of the, I hope you don't mind me saying this, Grant, but one of the grandfathers, I suppose, currently of wilderness photography in Tasmania, and as a result, he's a hero to many of us. We all looked up to you, Grant, and really looking forward to this presentation. And just before anyone asks further, I'm in a camper van front seat in St Helens with a mobile phone and a headlight, trying to light my face on the dodgiest laptop webcam you can get. So I apologise for that, but I've gone away with the family for a couple of weeks, and this is the compromise to allow me to continue on the show this week. But welcome, Grant, and I'll pass it on to you.
Well, thank you, guys. I hope I can live up to that sort of introduction.
Easily.
Yeah, so as Paul outlined, I'll show you a selection of images captured over 3 decades, probably no more than that, 3.5 decades, from a range of sort of mountain settings around the world, which is, I guess, my passion, cold places. Well, I do go to warm places as well. And maybe one of the reasons I go to these places often by myself is that so no one gets to see me wearing long trousers.
Good call, Grant.
Anyway, so without further ado, I'll take over the screen. Oops, no, that's not it. Hang on.
Grant, do you want to? I'd also be interested to give the audience a bit of I guess, a bit of a background on your roles and why you've walked so much of the land in Tasmania in particular, and you know, what was the initiation for what has become, you know, a multiple decades long love affair with the alpine areas of the world, like just in the bigger picture. I'd personally love to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, okay, so a bit brief bio, I guess. Well, I'm a Tasmanian. I was born in Hobart and I've always lived here when I've not been travelling. So the Tasmanian wild country is, you know, sort of where well, it was my back door. I could walk a block out of my home in West Hobart onto Mount Wellington, Kununyi, and beyond that it was just, you know, the wilderness. And capturing images out there sort of evolved, as with most bushwalkers, I guess, as a way of recording trips and having slideshows. You remember what they are when you came back to town. After a few years, a number of things were happening. The conservation issues were hotting up again in Tasmania, which became the Franklin River campaign. And people suggested that my images might be useful for, you know, showing what a nice place there is and what we might lose. So that sort of led me into getting involved with the Wilderness Society and a whole range of other conservation groups, which has been ongoing. Professionally, I trained as an earth scientist, a geologist, which I then put into practice both in the conservation movement and subsequently as a planner and sort of backcountry monitoring officer for the Park Service for 30 years, which I retired from about 5 years ago. And that's what Paul was referring to when he talked about me walking out there for a job for almost 20 years, from the mid-90s until 2015. I spent my summers out there wandering around, making measurements of things and trying to work out what was changing because of people's visitation, and then did my own private trips with my camera on top of that. So the wild places are very special to me generally, and therefore it was logical that I would go seeking them beyond Tasmania's shores. And when I was at university, the nearest and cheapest place you could go to look at sort of real mountains that I'd been reading about all through my high school time in, you know, magazines and mountain literature from around the world was New Zealand. So that's where I gained the sort of complementary set of skills that has led me to be able to go to all these places.
So you did some mountaineering courses over there?
Yeah, I was into walking and climbing here, but you know, if you by real mountains, essentially I mean glaciers. So you go to New Zealand and that was a tradition from the University Mountaineering Club for those who are in the climbing scene to go to New Zealand and do a course. Usually a particular one run by an expatriate Tasmanian over there in Wanaka. And then since then, I think I've been back to New Zealand at least 25 times in various summers, climbing, trekking, tramping as they call it over there. I'll talk a bit about that later on because a couple of the images I'm going to show you are from my more recent sort of New Zealand travels. In the early days.
You seem to have a more current love affair with Fiordland, Grant.
Yeah, well, I mean, I went to Fiordland amongst other places in that first trip to New Zealand, which was in 1978, 79.
Oh, wow.
All of my overseas trips have usually been pretty long. I mean, this reflects the era as well, because, you know, relatively speaking, back in the 1970s and 80s, airfares were bloody expensive. So if you were going to go anywhere, you stayed for a long time. So the first time I went to New Zealand, I spent 5 months there. So I saw a fair bit of the country. And yes, as I said, I've been back many times with my interests sort of evolving from sort of mountaineering outings, like particular routes on particular peaks, to long mountain journeys. And I'll talk about that change a bit when I'm showing you the photos as well. And then beyond, after New Zealand, yes, other places. South America was the next big trip, 1986. And again, I went for 5 months when I went. And every continent multiple times in the years since then. So I've been very fortunate to have had opportunities and a skill set that's got me to a lot of nice places.
I often think when I see your website, Grant, that I have this feeling of, I don't know if I need to go anywhere else now. As look at Grant's work, and he's been everywhere, so it's all he's already done it all. So I don't know what to do now.
Oh no, everywhere is like infinity. You know, it's impossible to reach. From my perspective, I've been walking around Tasmania for 45 years, but there's still places I haven't been that I'd like to get to while I'm still physically capable. Touch wood.
Yeah, just on that, your website is a cavernous black hole of images, and once you start going down the wormhole, you don't leave in a hurry. So I certainly encourage everybody to go to Grant's website. It's less of a showcase of a select number of images and more of a library of decades of work shown on there, and just the Tasmanian images alone, you'll spend hours and hours looking at, and then move on to other parts of the world. So I encourage you all after this to check out Grant's website. What's the URL, Grant?
The URL is www, obviously, Grant Dixon Photography, all one word, .com.au.
So I think also going back, I mean, Grant's been a very successful stock photographer for a long period of time, and that libraries all around the world have had huge amounts of his work. And I feel like, you know, he was lucky enough to be in an era where that was kind of viable, and he's put decades of time into building up that body of work. And I guess, you know, your website in a way kind of reflects, I guess, that to some extent, you know, whereas the modern way of doing things is a little bit like less is more, but in the larger bodies of real working photographers' career, it was really important to have a wider library and have, you know, people and those different kind of stock libraries to be able to sort through and find the different kind of styles and images that they needed.
Yeah, well, I mean, I should say, 2 points, I guess. Nick referred to my looking at my website as like going down a wormhole. Well, I mean, I feel a bit like that myself as the owner. It's sort of grown like Topsy over the years as I just keep adding images, and I keep thinking, I need to spend some time and go in and edit this old shit out that I don't like anymore, etc., etc. But when the scale of the task now is rather great that I keep putting it off. And as for stock, well, yes, as you said, I mean, I was lucky to have a bit of an era, the 1990s, really, when that was a viable proposition. But it's, you know, the whole business model, the whole world's changed with the rise of the internet and digital imagery, and everyone's got a camera in their phone, etc., etc. So that's very much on the wane. And in fact, the sole major library that I still have a lot of images with, Getty, has basically decided that they don't really want my stuff and many people like me anymore, because they're moving completely to away from a rights managed to a royalty free model. And as part of that, they basically kick all the rights managed people out and say, you can resubmit it in our new model if you like, up to you. Which basically means they win, photographers lose again. So yes, I wouldn't recommend going into image libraries these days.
Yeah, I mean, we'll save that conversation for another time, Grant, about how the industry's changed. It might come up by default through some of it, but that would be quite a long conversation, and one well worth having with someone like yourself that has seen and been through such a huge transition over a period of time, like few of us have, really. But yeah, the fact that you're still as current and relevant, and your work is still as world class as ever says mountains to how well you've navigated that pathway, Grant. So, which is another reason why we're all looking up to you, my friend.
Well, thanks, Paul. All right, we better look at some photos, I suppose.
Why not?
Hang on. Okay, that look all right?
Looks pretty beautiful.
Okay, so as I said in my sort of rambly introduction about myself, after a few seasons in New Zealand, gaining skills and exploring those sort of mountains, which, by the way, made me even more interested in the Tasmanian mountains and the Tasmanian mountains in winter, which I'll talk about a bit when we get to the section at the end, when I'll talk a bit about my new book. But the big overseas trip, New Zealand, of course, just being another state of Australia, was to South America, and I chose that. Thought I'd get a bite out of the New Zealander. The big overseas trip was to South America, and I chose that because, as I also said in the intro, I think I was really into mountain literature when I was at school, yeah, and there was a British mountain magazine called Mountain, which the library at my school actually got for some reason, and an issue that particularly sticks in my mind was a cover photo of a mountain called Cerro Torre, which is the most, in my view, spectacular granite spire on the planet. It's in Patagonia, which is the southernmost part of South America, split between Chile and Argentina. And I decided long before I actually got there that I want to go there, see those sorts of mountains. So, so with another Tasmanian photographer that I had a fair bit to do with in the day, Ted Mead, we got on a plane and flew off to Buenos Aires in the autumn of 1986. And the other reason we both chose to go there in autumn is because, as you might know, the southern continents have a ancient geological connection through Gondwana. And in South America, there are a range of species of Nothofagus, the same genus that occurs in New Zealand and Tasmania and other parts of Australia. But the big thing in South America is about 2/3 of them, and there's 10 or 11 species, are deciduous. So we wanted to go and see the fagus change colour in Patagonia, which is, it's a big thing in Tasmania for those of you who are out there. But I can assure you that having now seen it in South America, it's pretty different. It's more like the Northern Hemisphere. So with that in mind, we went there for a long period of time. I travelled, in fact, in South America for 5 months. And in particular, we wanted to travel in Patagonia for quite a length of time because the latitudinal range over which Nothofagus occurs means that you can follow it northwards as it's changing and see the colour for over a month. Right, and anyway, one of my images from that trip, this one is probably my favourite photo of a little Nothofagus shrub. It's called Nothofagus pumilio lenga in the local lingo, and it's very closely related to Nothofagus gunnii in Tasmania. In fact, if you see the leaves next to each other, they're almost identical, except lenga is often red when it changes colour. But this plant shrub had changed, lost its leaves. It was a perfectly still morning. We'd been camping in the area for 2 weeks, having been dropped off by a local guy in his car who said, "I'll see you in 3 weeks," with all our food, and just wandered around. So it was fantastic. This sort of black and white image is hanging on the wall of my lounge room, and I've been looking at it for 20 years. And
I thought I recognised it.
Yeah, I've never been disappointed in it. And same trip, and in fact quite almost the same place, but another sort of graphic composition from that trip. Glaciers. I'm really into glaciers, not just because they sort of epitomise, I guess, the cold mountain landscape, but my sort of earth science background means that I'm fascinated by how they sculpt the landscape, and particularly in places like Tasmania. But there'd been a couple of days before, there'd been some sort of overnight snowfall. So these swirls in the foreground are just sort of snow in the water, but it hadn't actually melted. The water must have been basically right on freezing. Again, really still, nothing disturbed around. Anyway, yeah, so in just wandering around, you find these magnificent sights. And I guess that's epitomised many of my my mountain trips. As I said, I had an era where I was, I guess, more into peak bagging, but more recently I just like wandering through the landscape for long periods of time. You've got to get out there for days at a time before you really get in sync with the place and start seeing things, I reckon.
So Grant, is there anything in particular in the way you approach a landscape photographically, or you just really intuitively just allow yourself to get drawn to whatever grabs your attention in the moment, or is there a little bit more deliberateness about some of the things you're trying to capture, or what's your process like?
Oh, it depends on the trip. I mean, a place like this, and any place I've ever been to before, it's more the former. You just go and see what happens. And with overseas travel, or travel generally, of course, you can control the time of year when you're going to travel, but you can't sort of do like I do in Tasmania a bit in winter, which I'll talk about later. Basically watch the weather and decide, okay, I'm going to Cradle Mountain tomorrow morning, sort of thing. I mean, it's a longer term planning exercise, so you have to make use of what you've got. You know? Well, that's the rule of travel photography generally, I guess, and just I just wander around and I just see things. I guess we all do that. Whereas on some trips, particularly like here, I might go to a place with a particular image in mind for a particular purpose. Like I don't know, there's a campaign in Tasmania trying to prevent helicopter access tourism development at Lake Malbina, which is a lake in the Tasmanian Highlands, and I went there a couple of years ago, specifically trying to find a viewpoint on Halls Island, which was the proposed site of the of the development, and the campaign is still ongoing. So things like that. There's a particular purpose, so you're looking for something. But generally, I prefer to photography in these places is part of the experience of being there. I mean, they're linked, and therefore it just comes to me when I'm out there, I guess.
Grant, are these earlier images slide or film?
Yes, I should say that too, actually. It's another issue to do with travel. Those two previous two are both on 35mm slide film, Kodachrome, I would imagine, or would have been Kodachrome. Can't remember whether it's 25 or 64. Yeah, everything up until 2006 was on film, mostly 35mm, some 6x7. The first trip I did with a digital camera was in the spring of 2006, and this image happens to be from that trip. So this is one of my first big trip with a digital camera, the mammoth megapixel 10 megapixel Nikon D200. And it was a return to Patagonia, in fact, which is sort of why I stuck it here. I'd been back in the previous years, so in 1986 I was back there in mid-90s doing some stuff. But from the very beginning, from the era, I guess, when I was reading about Patagonia in those mountain magazines, I was interested in traversing the Patagonian Ice Cap. There's two sort of extended, well, they're glacial, they're ice fields really, rather than ice caps, which straddle the Andes south of 45 degrees, between 45 and 50 degrees south. The southern one's the largest, several hundred kilometres long, and is relatively easily accessed, or the best part, the main part of it is easily accessed from the east, from the area around that mountain called Cerro Torre. So finally, in 2006, I found a couple of friends who were silly enough to think that it would be a good idea to accompany me, and we put a trip together and went over there and spent 3 weeks out on and traversing southwards across the Southern Patagonian Ice Cap. It's an area renowned for being windy, and we were pinned down in the middle of the ice cap for 5 days at this site, periodically going out to dig the tents out, etc. And on one of those occasions, I always took my camera when I went outside. The sky above cleared, the sky is still filled with blowing ice crystals, basically, and you've got this fantastic halo around the sun. So that sort of epitomizes Patagonia to me, not only because it's the experience, my personal experience of being there, but it just shows the wind and the extreme nature of the place. We were there for another 2 days after I took that, and then finally managed to escape after one of our tents got crushed to a sheltered area about half a day, go away to repair the tent, and then spend the next 2 weeks continuing southwards. The same part of the world and sort of a similar style of trip really, but the trip on which this photo was taken would be up there with one of my two best overseas mountain journeys, I guess, that I've been privileged to undertake. There's an island in the far South Atlantic called South Georgia. It's a British outpost, briefly invaded by Argentina in the 1982 Falklands conflict. And it's about 200 kilometres long. You might have heard of it because it's the scene of Antarctic explorer Ernest Shackleton's famous crossing when he sailed an open boat for 800 kilometres across the South Atlantic to make landfall, and then had to cross the island of South Georgia to a whaling station to get rescued for his stranded men back in Antarctica. Well, Shackleton crossed the island sort of southwest to northeast, which is its sort of the narrow point, it had never been traversed lengthways. So a guy I knew in Sydney decided to put together a trip, and thankfully rang me up and said, would you like to go along? And it didn't take very long to decide yes. So we got our shit together and flew to South America again, and got on a yacht that we'd arranged to charter, which itself had been sailed from Australia, and sailed for 12 days from Tierra del Fuego to South Georgia, and got dropped off at the northern end, and then spent a month traversing it to the southern end. And it was pretty wild, and there was glaciers that had never been crossed before, etc., etc. But this particular image was taken at the very end of that trip. We'd camped for 2 nights, I think, in the lee of that mountain you can see on the right, and waiting for the yacht Toluca to sail around and into the fjord below so we could descend and get picked up. And there was brief, it was pretty crappy weather, I think. We spent most of that time in the tent, but there was a big wind scour nearby that provided a bit of shelter and a bit of interest from just lying in the tent. All the books have been read by now. And it had these fantastic icicles just hanging off the lip. So that's what made this composition. The other fantastic thing about South Georgia, more than any of my other mountain journeys, is it's sort of a mountain journey at sea level, and it's on a subantarctic island, which are just teeming with wildlife around the coast. These critters, which are basically weaning elephant seals, just lie around on the beach after they've been weaned, waiting to become, I don't know, muscly enough to actually swim off. Just evolve from these sausage things to actually have, be out mobile and get to the sea. So, and they're, that's what they do. They lie there and doze. So it just made a fantastic composition. And we're just walking down the beach past them. It's amazing. And a bit further down the beach, there's a colony of 10,000 king penguins squawking away, and birds wheeling around overhead. Yeah, it's just a fantastic wildlife experience, this part of the world. And we were there, 4 of us, and no one else for weeks.
Fantastic. Just talking on sub-Antarctic islands, you've been to Macquarie Island, I assume, Grant?
Yeah, I have. During my work with the Tasmanian Parks Service, I went down there for a summer to look at human impact stuffs. And so, yes, I've been lucky enough to spend 2 months on Macquarie Island. It's another amazing place, but quite different to this. I mean, same sort of wildlife, but Macquarie Island's sort of like a green and lush, whereas South Georgia is sort of raw and yeah, more raw.
Yeah, fantastic. If you've got any hints or tips on how to get one of us down there, me, that'd be great.
Join the queue, Nick.
I've been on the queue for a long time.
Nick's at the front. Nick's definitely at the front of the queue.
Yeah,
I don't know how I'd get there.
I'm happy to meet you over a coffee sometime, but I don't think I'm going to have any useful intelligence, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I think it's a bit different these days.
Okay, so I thought while we're in that part of the world, I'd show, this is the only image I'm going to show you tonight of Antarctica. I've also had 2 trips to the Antarctic continent. One was a summer I spent with the Antarctic Division, photographing their science program, which was another great opportunity. And the other was a private trip to the Antarctic Peninsula, again, sailing by yacht from the southernmost part of South America. Quite late in the season, because we were accompanying a group of guys who wanted to kayak down the edge of the peninsula, and they could only do that later in the season when the sea ice had broken up. And the rest of us on board got put ashore in various places to do stuff. And the best of those outings for me was a 3-day, 2-night foray inland to climb a mountain called Mount Shackleton, actually, named the Antarctic explorer related to South Georgia. And this was on the way to Mount Shackleton, navigating our way through these massive crevasses, and just this great weather, great day, nice backlighting, just really came together. A lot of the time we were down there, because it was quite late in the season, the weather was pretty grey and drab. So having a day like this just seemed one out of the box in particular.
Those crevasses look pretty intimidating, Grant.
Yeah, well, they are, but we figured perhaps a bit casually at the time, in hindsight, but they're so bloody big that you could see where they were. So we navigated the maze. There was a few hundred meters like this. We're just in the edge of it, heading off back. You can't see behind me, obviously, see where the footprints are going. We just had to get through the edge before we get onto the ridge that led up to this peak.
So Grant, I'm guessing you spent a lot of time when you're trying to photograph some of these expeditions, either racing ahead or having to catch up from behind. Is that kind of a big part of you almost need to be a touch fitter than everybody else probably to be able to get the photos?
Well, the short answer is yes. And again, I was going to talk about that in a couple of photos' time, because it relates in particular to a couple of other mountain journeys. But yes, if you're going to take images like this with your companions, and I often do try to capture images like this, of this style when on these journeys, because it provides the sense of scale. Obviously, it sounds a bit unoriginal, but it's true. And also perhaps a bit more of a feel for the place. I mean, traditionally, I guess wilderness images are people-free, but of course none of them are ever people-free, because there's a bod behind the camera, and in places like this there's usually other bods that have helped you get there, and your companions, for both social as well as safety reasons. So it's why not include them as well? But yes, you either need very understanding and compliant companions all the time, which again wears thin after weeks, or in these places where everyone's under stress, keeping alive and such like, or you need to just be fitter so you can get ahead or catch up after you get left behind, or you anticipate, change your route so that you're running parallel to them at some stage, etc. So in this case, this person is a young Danish woman who was on the yacht. Yes, she was just very understanding, thankfully. Not all of my mountain trips are these hardcore expeditions. I've done quite a few treks in Nepal, both the more well-known areas as well as to sort of more out-of-the-way places. And this is one of the latter, a month-long outing to the west of Nepal to a region called Dolpo, which is up near the Tibetan border. Fantastic sort of arid landscape, because it's on the northern side of the Himalaya chain in the rain shadow. And I guess the lesson, if you like, of this image and ones like it is that just because the weather's bad, getting out in bad weather often gives you the best images. The rest of the group, the trekking party was 8, plus porters and guides and all the other stuff that you have to have if you're going to do anything in Nepal. They're the rules. They were all lying in their tent or sitting around in the mess tent playing cards, etc., etc. But when it started snowing, I just thought there must be some fantastic stuff out here, and this is one of them. It's a sort of a chorten around a quite famous Buddhist monastery, Shea Gompa, made famous by Peter Matheson in his book The Snow Leopard. And yeah, just the prayer flags and the colours really made the image for me.
Such a beautiful country.
And on the same trip, and really I guess the same lesson, a few days later we crossed our last high pass, and the camp below the pass was in this sort of canyon, shaded most of the time, so the waterfalls that were falling down the sides had essentially frozen, because we're still sort of coming out of winter. How were we? anyway, it's still cold, obviously, and it had been snowing. The snowfall, in fact, that was in the previous photo, the fresh snow here is probably from that. Anyway, exploring away from the base camp, everyone basically retired to the tents or the mess tent again when camp was set up. But I went for a walk up the canyon, and this waterfall at the head had just formed these fantastic icicles around it, but was still falling down behind it. So yeah, great patterns. I revisited a couple of times while we were camped there. It's only about 10 minutes walk from the tents, but no, I don't think anyone else went there. Interesting. But yes, it produced which is one of my favourite images from that trip.
Beautiful.
Still in the Himalaya, which, as Paul said, I've spent a lot of time in the Himalaya, in Nepal, in India, and in Pakistan. This is in the Indian part of the Himalaya, in a region called Ladakh, which is, Kashmir, really. So a disputed region, and currently very disputed, unfortunately, with both India and China fighting each other again on the border, as well as some of the Kashmiri population trying to throw off the yoke of the Indian government. But the Himalayan chain is very long, 3,000 odd kilometres, and changes in character significantly as it sort of swings northwards and then enters Pakistan and splits off into multiple ranges. And the Ladakh landscape is quite arid because of its distance north in the rain shadow. Monsoon doesn't get there. So it's a raw landscape, which appeals to the geologist in me, I guess. All the rocks sticking up, and particularly this country where the rock strata are almost vertical, so you've got these teeth and ridges sticking out of the landscape. So I was camped taken on a 4-day trek that I did with my partner Rhonda in the area. No one else around. We were camped below this little pass that I'm now standing on in the photo, and I just thought early in the morning there'd be nice shadows from the rocks, so I went up there to see what it looked like. And what I didn't expect was this fantastic autumn colour of all these little shrubs, willows and things, which were nowhere near as dense as anywhere else that we saw on that trip than just here. So it was sort of a composition partly envisaged or foreseen, and partly just fortuitous, having the coloured vegetation there when I got there.
So you've got a great warm, cool mix and a light and shadow play as well. So, yeah, it's wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, that's a sort of combination that I really like. And again, comes up a bit in my Tasmanian stuff that I'll talk about at the end. This warm colours and cool colours in the same image, blue shadows and red sunlit mountains. Just fantastic. This, I guess, one thing I've been attracted to over during my time travelling through the mountains is seeking compositions that I guess I'd like to call mountain portraits. And so I've got a few of what I'm talking about. This and the following one were both taken on the same trip. It was a climbing expedition that I organised to a mountain called Pumori in Nepal, which is directly opposite Everest. And that's Everest on the left with the moon just above it. So it's sort of the classic, or the most seen view of Everest is, of course, from the so-called Everest Base Camp trek, or a little peak above Everest Base Camp called Kalapatar. But that's far too low to be able to see up the glacier that you've got at the bottom, the famous Khumbu Glacier, and up to the South Col, which is right in the middle of the photo. You need to be a couple of thousand metres higher, and that's what being up on the slopes of Pumori, which we were trying to climb, gave me. So I sort of saw this composition on one of the times we climbed up there to carry our gear, and arranged to basically be in a high camp for a few days when the weather looked like it might be nice, and captured this composition. And Paul mentioned earlier that I used to sell quite a few images through libraries around the world, and this one and the other one, my two photos of Everest, have been my best ever selling images over 30 odd years.
Oh. How high were you up there taking that photograph?
To the About 6,300 metres probably I'm at. Everest, of course, is still 2,500 metres higher.
Mm.
The highest
Now,
elevation
what's-
you have been to, Grant?
Sorry, Nick, did you say?
What's the highest elevation you have climbed to?
A bit over 7,700.
Oh.
In fact, I've got a photo from that trip coming up.
Wow.
That's high.
Do you, what do you do to for altitude sickness and things like that? Do you is any remedies there or anything like that?
Well, I don't know, maybe I'm just lucky, but I've always just winged it. I've always found that I acclimatise pretty quickly, and I operate pretty well at altitude. So I'm lucky. Well, I know I'm lucky because I've been around companions who've very much been feeling pretty ill, and sometimes had to go down. But touch wood, I've been fine. And
It often doesn't matter how fit you are; it's just how your body's made up in that sense. Yeah.
well, I think that's largely it. I mean, there are sort of drugs and things that are around and that some people take or swear by these days. I'm not into pharmaceutical assistance if I can avoid it with anything. So so I prefer to just listen to my body. But touch wood, it's worked pretty well for me over the years. This is that second photo of Everest I was talking about. It's not taken from quite as high up on Patagonia. In fact, it's probably taken from down the bottom, nearer to the conventional view from Kalapatar near Everest Base Camp. But of course, what makes it was these fantastic clouds, lenticular clouds over the summit at sunset. It must have been so windy up there.
That's an incredible shot. And that's one of your highest selling ones, like the other one.
Yeah, I can't remember which is which, but both the two together. And there's another one with a sort of sickle moon in it, but yeah, photos from that trip, those two or three have been the ones that have been most published in various images.
And this was on slide film?
Yeah, oh yes. Just about all of the images you've seen so far have probably, the dark ones wouldn't have been. But anyway, yes, this is on slide film. Probably Kodachrome again, I reckon, given the time. Actually, I mean, talking about film, something else I guess I could reflect on is back in the day, as I said, these trips, in particular long trips like my time in South America, I'd be away for many months. You can't buy film there, or yes, you can, but I mean, I didn't want to rely on buying film, so you go on a trip like that, you take everything with you. And at least for me, back in those days, film was pretty expensive. So I think I probably went to South America for 5 months with something like 60 rolls. And you don't take photos, just casually, and you certainly don't shoot off, a roll on something that's nice. So all of these images are probably just one shot. That's it. In these days, of course, with the flexibility that digital gives you in many different ways, I'd never want to go back. But it was a practical issue. And then I'd either have to carry the exposed film, and you'd never know when you got something, of course, until you got back and had it processed, or trust it to some postal service registered post from Nepal or Pakistan or Argentina, and hope that it was back home when I got home. And I never lost anything, thankfully. Okay, so mountain portraits. This was an early one. My New Zealand peak bagging era in the early 1980s. One that I think worked the best of all the things that I did back then photographically. This is Mount Tasman, and it's second highest mountain in New Zealand, just north of Mount Cook. And to get something like this, I had to convince my climbing partner to not do the traditional thing and leave the hut at the bottom of the mountain, the traditional Mount Cook alpine start of about 12 midnight, 1 in the morning, and then trudge up, which would have meant that we crested this summit ridge well into the morning when the light would have been crap. But I convinced him to leave the evening before, and we climbed halfway up the ridge and then bivvied. So we were actually at the crest of the ridge at about 3,000 odd metres here, probably at sunrise. And it was a good call because we got this image, and then we continued up the ridge between light and shade there, and stood on the summit early in the morning, and we're back down for afternoon tea. So anticipate. Well, I mean, it's not an original rule lesson, I guess, but yeah, foreseeing what might be and anticipating the light, etc., is obviously a worthwhile exercise and can put you in nice places with the potential to capture nice images. This one, for example, though, is sort of an image captured more because of endurance, I guess, rather than being in the right place at the right time. The mountain is Mount Foraker, which is in Alaska. It's just north of Denali, and I was on an expedition climbing on Denali, and we'd been stuck at the high camp for 8 days, I think, in one of Denali's infamous storms. But the high camp, which is at about 18,000 feet, you have to talk in feet if you're in America, is right on the lip of this big escarpment. So it was only 50 metres walk from where we were camped to this magnificent view. Well, it turned out I discovered there was a magnificent view when there was a break in the storm, and anytime the wind dropped, you'd just get out of the tent just for exercise and wander around. And yes, on one occasion in the evening, this is what I was presented with, just this fantastic view across this band of colour. Didn't last long, but anyway, we hung on for another couple of days and got to the summit just in time with hardly any food left. But photographically, this was the high point. Yeah, another mountain portrait, which did quite well in a photographic competition in the 1990s, from memory. But this mountain was named by an Italian mountaineer in the 1950s, whose name escapes me, as the most beautiful mountain in the world, which is a big call and obviously a serious value judgment. But yeah, it is pretty nice, these fluted ice face here. The mountain's called Alpamayo, and it's in the Peruvian Andes. And I think the thing that most sticks in my mind about this, which was taken from not far again from our high camp, the location for which was partly selected for photogenic reasons, is I'd recently acquired my first high quality tripod, a carbon fiber Gitzo Mountaineer, rather than the sort of lighter weight things that I've been carrying around in the years before on trips like this, because weight's very important for, well, I'll talk a bit about weight and gear in a minute. Anyway, I chose to carry my Gitzo Mountaineer all the way up here to our high camp at about 5,000 metres. And yes, looking at this photo, I think it was worthwhile.
So you couldn't have got it without it, Grant?
I almost certainly could, but I tell myself that's what justified me carrying it up there. I mean, I listened to one of your guest presentations a few weeks ago. What's his name? Mr.
William Patino.
Yeah, for Fiordland, and I was quite interested in talking about basically never using a tripod. And I guess with modern digital cameras and such like and vibration reduction lenses and such like, it has become easier. But with Kodachrome film and low light, your options are and old.
What ASA were you generally using, Grant?
Well, it would have been probably 64 if I was shooting Kodachrome. I'd moved on to Fuji later, in which case I preferred the 100 ASA film, Provia, but I think this is probably on Kodachrome. So yeah, you're talking about pretty slow shutter speeds to try and handhold anything. I mean, or try to brace against a rucksack or something. I guess, I mean, through all of these sorts of trips, of course, in most cases, me and my companions are carrying our stuff ourselves. Treks in Nepal, of course, you have porters and the like, but all of my mountain trips, we've carried our own gear up the mountains. And in many of the approaches, they're basically lightweight expeditions. It's the style of travel that I like. This particular trip was just with one mate from Hobart. The two of us just flew to Peru and then spent a month wandering around and climbing these mountains on, I think, 4 separate trips of up to a week's duration. So we had to walk in, carry all our stuff to eat, live and climb for that duration. So camera gear, which is obviously important to me, has to be selected in the context of what you can physically carry rather than what you'd actually like to have. So here I was probably, whilst I carried my new shiny new Gitzo Mountaineer tripod up here, I almost certainly only had a camera and a couple of lenses. I can't remember what they would have been. On some
that was one of my questions, Grant. Like you become an expert in lightweight alpinist sort of photography, and I guess with the different systems you've changed over time. But say through this era in particular, did you have a consistent pairing of the two kind of lenses, or any sort of favorites that you tend to fall back on?
I think, well, this particular trip was in 1996, so I would have had I had a Nikon FM2. I liked that in the mountains because it was both bomb-proof and it wasn't controlled by batteries. And I probably had just two lenses, a 28 and an 85 prime, both f2s, I think they were. And that previous one would have been taken with the 28. This one's probably taken with the 85. And they're both excellent sharp lenses.
How does that compare to your current day setup, Grant?
I've got a drawer full of stuff, but what goes on what trip depends on what I'm doing.
You moved into zoom lenses, I think, when they started getting good enough, from what I could tell, Grant. But
well, that's true, but I've still got primes as well, and I oscillate between what I want to take. On winter trips, though, particularly in Tasmania, which I'll talk about, of course, later, I favour zooms because changing lenses in crap weather when light's changing fast, fleeting moments, is just a recipe for frustration and wrist slashing, I think. So yes, for these sort of the Tasmanian trips that I do, I've become a zoom user. But if I put a prime on and go out and take an image and then look at it, I think, yeah, that's why I've got the prime. I just thought I'd put this one in because it's almost exactly the same. It's taken from almost the same place as this, just slightly different light, and it just gave me another ice composition in different light, which I really liked. All right, those trips, the last ones that the mountain portraits are from, were all sort of basically. We want to get to the summit type trips, peak bagging trips, if you like. Even though the approaches and therefore the journeys to get there were part of the experience as well. They're focused around getting to the top of something. But in the late 90s, I sort of moved on to seeing the idea of sitting at a base camp as essentially a waste of time, especially if you've put a lot of time and effort and money into getting there. And moving through the landscape, mountain journeys, if you like, was far more fulfilling. And if you happen to climb a few viewpoints along the way, even if they weren't the highest point in the landscape, that was ultimately more fulfilling overall. My favourite part of the world in terms of mountain landscapes generally, as distinct from individual peaks, is probably the mountains of Pakistan, and in particular the Karakoram Range. And this image, which it's nice, but I wouldn't consider it one of my best, but it's the best for showing that amazing landscape. And it's an amazing landscape because the mountains themselves are composed of a pretty hard rock, mostly granite. So they're steep, they don't fall down quickly like the New Zealand mountains. And because of its geography within the Himalaya, but also, I won't try and explain the meteorological characteristics, but it's probably the most extensively glaciated area in terms of the size of the glaciers outside the polar regions. So the whole range, 250 kilometre long range, is just divided up by these massive glaciers, tens of kilometres long, and these ice highways just provide this inviting route zigzagging through the range. So in 2004, I joined an English or Scottish mountain guide I'd previously met in Pakistan and some other people, including another friend from Tasmania, Annette Dean, on a 35-day traverse of the whole range following those glaciers, something again which had never been linked together before. pulling sleds, crossing 5 or 6 passes between 5,000 and 5,600 metres, and it was just amazing. And that with South Georgia, it's my other all-time favourite mountain journey. On this particular day, this particular morning, we just crested our third pass. We're already a week behind our schedule because of deep snow and snowfalls and crap weather. And then we got a day like this, and it was just why we were there. That triangular peak on the left in the distance is K2, which is the second highest mountain on Earth. And the Karakoram collectively has got 4 or 5 of the 8,000 metre peaks in close proximity, which is just another way of saying how spectacular it is. So another part of Pakistan, and an example of the thing you asked a question about earlier, I think, Paul, basically getting in front or behind people.
Or parallel.
Or parallel in this case, yes. I sort of foresaw this coming because you could see the shadow on the glacier up ahead where the sun was, and we were still in the shade moving up the glacier. It's in the Hindu Kush range, which is on the western side of Pakistan on the border with Afghanistan, and an area that is now off limits for fairly obvious reasons. So I just thought that if I could ski parallel to David and time it right, I'd get the sun star as it appeared. And this would have been taken with that camera combination that I mentioned before too, the Nikon FM2 and that 28mm lens. So it produced fantastic sun stars. And this is on the same trip up high on the mountain. Two of us had just managed to make it to the summit of our chosen peak, which is a mountain called Tirish Mir, and descending, looking out over, a country you can't visit anymore, at least as far as we're concerned, Afghanistan. All those mountains in the distance are in Afghanistan. And just again reinforced how spectacular this country was. It's also very much easier to take an image like this one when descending, because you're not so breathless as when you're going up. I'm probably at about 7,400 metres here. Got David to stop for a bit before scurrying off down to the tent and wetting our parched thirst after a long day out. But just sort of all came together compositionally and in terms of the backlighting, partly because we'd been out so long. We hadn't planned on taking that long to get to the summit and back. But anyway, there's always a silver lining, I guess.
I assume when you're going for a summit, Grant, you might just choose the one lens to bring up.
I probably did only take the wide angle to the summit on that trip. I don't remember taking it. I might have even only taken that simple combination up to the high camp too, and I don't think I had my tripod up there either. And still in Pakistan, this is on that aforementioned long journey through the Karakoram, but another example of just seeing what looked like a nice composition with these snow-filled crevasses and the partial backlighting, and deciding to take a different route to Dave here with his sled on a parallel ridge, so I could capture something like this.
It's showing a real impeccable sense of timing there too, to be able to get the figure in just the right spot there. It's
I would have had to have got into the position earlier and then stopped for 30 seconds to catch my breath, because we're at 5,000 meters again here or something like that, and wait for Dave to go there. But once again, it would have been just a one-shot thing. I'm shooting on film here, and certainly didn't have capacity to restock with film halfway through the Karakoram. What I don't remember noticing at the time I captured the photo are those amazing clouds coming
They
off.
look like geysers.
Yeah, that's right. They make the mountains look like volcanoes, which they're definitely not. But anyway, it sort of adds a bit of interest.
Grant, you must have some crazy stories of some of the times you've been trying to change film, because it's not always convenient when those moments come up.
No, well, that's right. You used to have to keep an eye on the count, and so you knew when it was number 35 was coming up, and And if you're heading out for a sunrise, you have to make a decision. Well, do I just waste the last one so I can have a fresh roll in, or risk it? And this is my final shot from Pakistan. But the other thing that's fascinating about big mountain landscapes is there's detail on a big scale, if you like. This is a cliff several hundred meters high, bottom to top, and just these fantastic pattern of dikes, light coloured rock intruding the darker granite in the wall of a steep-sided glacial valley. So provided obviously a bit of scenic interest and a pleasant opportunity to stop and catch my breath while the others skied on with their sleds. But of course then I had to catch up.
You can take a excuse me. You can take a very similar image here in Tasmania, Grant, a scale of maybe a metre wide or something like that in the Tarkine on the shorelines. It's amazing to see that that cliff and seeing that huge scale of a pattern that actually seems pretty familiar to me, but on a very, very small scale.
Yeah, well, of course, you get detail at every scale, of course, and without a scale measurement, it's just a graphic feature, and that's what was interesting about that. But yes, when you explain the context, or when I explained the context, because I've used that image in a number of slideshows of that trip over the years. Yes, people sort of usually don't get it until it's explained to them, the scale of that the field of view there. These are another set of very steep-sided mountains, and a more recent destination for some of my trips has been the Canadian Arctic, and in particular Baffin Island, which is right up north of eastern Canada, north of Hudson Bay, just across Davis Strait from Greenland, on the Arctic Circle basically. And there's a number of named and famous mountains there. This one's called Mount Asgard. Just down the valley is Mount Thor. I think this one became to sort of international fame because in some early James Bond film, James Bond, or at least his stunt double, parachuted off the top of it, when he was escaping the bad guys or something. I can't remember the detail of the film. But anyway, it's an amazing mountain. It's sheer on three sides. Those cliffs are over 1,000 meters high, and the four of us were just slogging up the glacier in a conga line, and I decided that maybe I'd let the others get ahead and form a bit of a scale for the mountains on this unusually clear day.
Yeah, it looks like you've got a bit of catching up to do, Grant.
Yeah, and sort of trying to catch up with it when you're pulling the sleds, a bit harder work. It's sort of catchy.
Definitely worth it for that sense of scale, though. Has so much impact. Unreal.
It is easier catching them when they've broken the trail, though, and I can just follow the little sled line.
Method in your madness.
That's right. And another Arctic image, and this was on a more recent trip in 2018. Same area, but even further north, Bylot Island, which is just off the northern end of Baffin Island and at the mouth of the Northwest Passage. So it's about 70 degrees north. And me and three others, including two of the people from that first trip, who are Canadian friends and who are into this country, and they're the organisers of these trips. So I just turn up and go along. Anyway, we did a month-long circuit on Bylot Island, which is a 200-kilometre wide glaciated island north of Baffin Island, and once again, the route is when you're pulling these sleds is to stay on the glaciers, and then you just do side trips. They're too heavy to do otherwise, and you can't drag them in steep country because they weigh about 60 kilos or more. So heading day one up the glacier, we got to the outlet of the glacier, which in summer would be flowing water flowing out of an ice cave, but in winter there was this enticing opening with a frozen river below, which we walked into to discover these amazing frost crystals. Some of them are 1/2 metre long. And it's just so still in there that they just grow. You touch one of them, it just falls apart. but yeah, I've never seen anything like it. We never found another cave like it during the rest of the trip either. So it was yeah, just luck following the river, and you stumble across these photogenic gems. The other interesting thing about this cave was that inside it was just below zero, so it's like, but outside it was about -20, so it's like a reverse fridge. All right, just conclude these sort of overseas ones with a couple of New Zealand shots. As I said, my introduction to glaciated mountains was New Zealand back in 1978, and what I was attracted to back then, being a sort of 20-year-old peak bagger, was climbing the things, but more recently, and in particular since about 2010, in conjunction with a similarly interested mate from New South Wales, another photographer called Ian Brown, have been undertaking some long mountain journeys, in particular in Fiordland, the southwest part of the South Island, which I've been fascinated with since the very beginning. But it's turns out Ian, who I only met in more recent years, turns out to have had a similar lifelong fascination. So we've teamed up and spent a lot of time wandering in the backcountry of Fiordland, often on multi-week trips. And this is probably not the best photo I've taken during all of those trips, but it just encapsulates what it's all about as far as I'm concerned. This magnificent mountain scenery and beautiful evenings in that landscape, far from anywhere. This is 3 weeks into a 4-week trip. Apart from a couple of deer hunting helicopters that we heard in the distance, we'd seen no one for the whole time. Yeah, there's this evening looking out across at the highest mountain in Fiordland, Tutako.
Grant, we've just had a question from YouTube if you were able to meet Edmund Hillary at all.
Well, as it turns out, the first time, my first trip to New Zealand, 1978, when I went and did that climbing course, which was at Aspiring National Park, me and the guy I went with went back in to attempt to climb Mount Aspiring and a few other peaks afterwards. And as we were climbing up French Ridge towards Mount Aspiring, we met 3 guys coming down, and it turned out to be Ed Hillary, his son Peter, and another mate. So I did in fact have a 30-second passing chat to Ed Hillary in 1978. Yes.
Fantastic.
That rubbed off on you, Grant.
And yeah, this is classic for me, Fiordland landscape, glaciated landscape. It's in a pretty remote part of Fiordland, a designated wilderness area, so no tracks, no huts, no helicopter landings. It's actually at the end of that same long trip that the previous image was taken from. So this is probably almost 4 weeks in, a couple of days before I arrived at Milford Sound, and yeah, just the unusually still landscape and the amazing angles of the glaciated rocks just really appealed. The mountain's called Mount Grave, which is named after a Mr. Grave, not anything sort of morbid, and is in the Darren Mountains, which are the highest mountains in Fiordland.
Fantastic. I don't think I've seen anything like that from Fiordland.
Yeah, so I mean, the Fiordland landscape's just different around every corner. It's one of the things that's fascinating about it. But it's only in the northernmost part of Fiordland where you get the mountains are composed of these crystalline rocks, which are granites and very high-grade metamorphic rocks, which just form these sculpted, smooth shapes, a bit like the Yosemite landscape. It's the same principle at work. Glaciers and crystalline rock, basically. All right, that's the end of Tasmania. Hang on, I just need to find my other slideshow. Won't be a sec.
Yeah, that's easier.
Well, it was pretty special, Grant. Anyway, and so you're going to talk to us now about your new book.
Yes,
Winter
we'll
Light.
talk about this.
I'll tell you what. there are a lot of very excited people out there, including myself. This book's coming out. This is your first book.
It is, yes, and it's well, as the title suggests, and I think as you or Paul might have mentioned at the beginning, it's basically a book of Tasmanian winter landscapes and details. By way of how did I come to accumulate all these winter photos of Tasmania? Well, after those early trips to New Zealand, I guess I came back to Tasmania with new eyes, thinking that there must be nice stuff here when there's a bit of snow in the landscape as well, and also driven by, I guess, a young man's desire to prove himself in the mountains by climbing things with all these skills that I was now, of course, an expert in after just a few weeks in New Zealand. And so I had a couple of trips in winter in 1980, 81, which produced spectacular scenes that just made me appreciate the how good and how special the Tasmanian landscape in winter could be, but also the challenge of capturing nice images in that setting, because a classically wintry appearance to the Tasmanian landscape is very fleeting because of the temperate nature of the Tasmanian climate and the relatively low altitude of our mountains, etc., etc. Hence, to accumulate a collection of images that across the range of places and weather conditions of Tasmania in winter has taken many decades. In fact, the oldest photo in the book, which is just a photo of a trip with a little story, was taken in 1981. So there's almost 40 years of images in the book, although most of them are from the last 25 years, and the most of those are probably from the last 10, and therefore my digital era. But there's still quite a few film photos in the book. So I'll give you a bit of a taster. This is my cover shot, and is a more recent capture, 2018, when the stars aligned. I guess the stars being my capacity of, based on years of experience of reading weather forecasts and thinking, oh yes, it might be nice here, and knowledge from repeated visits to places, so I knew both how to get there and what to expect. This is in the Dixon Range, which is in Cradle Mountain, Lake St Clair National Park. An access would involve a day, a long paddle up the lake, Lake St Clair, and then a day and a half's walk. But the particular story behind this photo is that day and a half's walk was a long slog in soft snow, even with snowshoes on it was soft. And I'm carrying a fair bit of stuff because this was a trip that was very, very photo oriented. I decided I wanted to not only traverse the Dixon Range, which I hadn't done continuously before, but I wanted to have the capacity to capture a range of images. So I carried, I think, 4 lenses, including my long zoom, as well as my tripod, plus a week's food and survival and climbing gear, crampons, snowshoes, etc.
So what did that weigh, Grant?
It was probably about 30 kilo pack.
Yeah.
Anyway, so after my grovel up from the valley to a camp near here, I was pretty knackered. So, and it was one of those afternoons where the cloud was coming and going, so there was always the potential for nice light. So I thought, okay, I'll just lie down and have a rest, and then wake up and then get up and see what's happening nearer to sunset. And I went to sleep. And I don't know what it was. Something woke me up. Probably this light actually, because I looked out of the tent door, which was facing this and about 100 meters back from the lake, and thought, shit, it's all happening. It's one of those evenings where there's just that gap between the cloud and the horizon, which somehow funnels and accentuates the light, so you get this brilliant red, but it doesn't last long. And I knew that without looking. So I jumped out of the tent, shoved my feet into the boots, didn't lace them up, sprinted towards the lake, tripped on my bootlaces, face first into the snow, and what's even worse, plunged my camera lens first into the snow as well.
Oh no.
So thankfully there wasn't anyone nearby with a video or anything, which me sort of frantically hobbling to the lake with socks on and scraping the snow off the lens, trying to get the bloody tripod set up so I could put the camera on it before all this disappeared. Anyway, obviously
with
it
that
did
at this
just,
spot,
but I
Grant,
only got
frozen
this.
boots on and things like that. It's much fun.
Anyway, so yes, I got one shot and then one more looking in another direction, and then that was it. The light went. So you can sort of reflect on the moment and think, oh, well, if only I'd woken up a bit sooner, how many other fantastic images might I have captured? Because I've no idea how long this had been happening before I became aware of it. But anyway, there's no point in going there.
It's good to know that I'm not the only one that plans fall apart because I fall asleep in the tent or something like that. And I reckon there'll be a few other people watching this that can relate to that sort of thing too.
Yeah, we can all relate to that one, I think, Grant. I don't know. I mean, how many times you must have been trying to massage your way into frozen boots over the years, Grant?
Yeah, well, that's sort of another pleasant aspect of.
You must have it as
Tasmanian
an
winters.
art form by now.
Well, I don't know whether there's ever any artistic way of doing it. I mean, I do think, having obviously spent a lot of time in cold places outside Tasmania and seriously cold places like the Canadian Arctic, that it somehow often feels colder and more unpleasant in Tasmania, which I can only put down to the fact that it's more often than not hovering around zero, and there's a lot of moisture in the air.
Moisture.
And you just feel the cold more. I'd much prefer it to be -5 and dry than zero. And that combined with the fact that, as you say, the approaches are often damp, so your boots and other stuff gets wet, and then if there's a clear night, which is produces light like this and the previous one, for example, everything freezes, including your boots, even in the tent, it's just you learn how to manage it, but I wouldn't say it's ever pleasant. Okay, this image is taken some years previous to the other one. It's Cradle Mountain, but from the east rather than the conventional view from the north. And once again, I sort of just wandered up there to see what I could find. And I woke up in the morning and it looked like there was a cloud bank out to the east, although I couldn't actually see the eastern horizon. So I was half resigned to nothing happening. So I was just wandering around. I did have my boots laced up this time though. And then this started happening. There was obviously another one of those gaps between the horizon and the cloud that I couldn't see. So I started running around looking for something that would make it work, and found this little tarn with the cracks. Not quite at the last minute, but pretty close, because it wasn't long after this that the red faded and it just became, merged into a less interesting lighting as the sun got up, and then became a fine sunny day.
It's an interesting pattern there in the ice as well. Was that tannins or something gathered in that shape?
Yeah, I think it might be partly the colour of the water, but it might also be just that, for some reason, it's partly thawing ice just gets this different colour. I've got an image which is in my book, but I haven't got it here tonight, of Lake Newdigate at Tarn Shelf, Mount Field National Park, not far from Hobart, which is full-on spring thaw, and the whole lake is this browny. The ice in the lake is this browny yellowy colour, which I've actually never seen much before, but it's related to the thawing. And those lakes, the Mount Field lakes, aren't tannin water because they're in the country that's got clear watered lakes. So it's something about the thawing, but I don't know what it is. Maybe there's some algae or something growing in it. Anyway, yes, the lesson here, I guess, is that if I'd spent time, I think I probably got into camp too late for it anyway, but if I'd spent time scoping, I might have found this tarn the day before and actually gone straight to it, or some other composition, but I didn't. So it was very much a running around looking for something at the last minute type scenario. Whereas the previous one, the one where I almost stuffed up by going to sleep, I had the composition in mind. I just didn't get myself into position at the right time quickly enough. And this is a bit of both of those situations, I guess. This is, again, up in my beloved Karakoram Range in that winter of August 2018. Particularly good snowfall. I mean, these sort of what I'd call truly wintry settings in Tasmania really only happen for a few days, maybe once or twice a winter if you're lucky, on the after a southwesterly blow which has dumped the snow and been cold, and before anything starts thawing, which happens remarkably quickly after the southwesterly sometimes, and that's when you get both the more pleasant conditions for travel, because once you're in the snow you don't get wet from the snow, and the delicate formations, the rime, ice on the rocks, etc., all of which soon disappear when the temperature gets above freezing. Here, I think, according to the Liawini, which is on the Central Plateau further east, Met Bureau data, it stayed below zero for several days, which is so I was lucky, not only for travel, that I could travel on the snow rather than in it, but I had stuff like this for a couple of days.
With those sort of conditions, Grant, are you looking for a sort of a high system over Tassie directly after a big sort of system has come through?
Yes, in the short, which basically means, well, it depends on where you want to go, but it means you've got to get yourself there before the crap weather comes through, or walk in the crap weather, and get up high to be ready for it. I guess that, broadly speaking, that's been my strategy for many trips, and is what's led to me capturing images like this, and the previous two, really. Both of them were
quite famous for that, Grant. If the weather's shit, Grant's got to be out trying to get somewhere good while everyone else is waiting for it to get better.
I mean, it doesn't always work. Sometimes the gap never comes, or at least the cloud never lifts enough before it swings northwest and becomes wetter. But I mean, it's pretty well. I find it much more reliable trying to do it these days than back in the day before modern weather forecasting, and also back in the day when I had the capacity to, or didn't have the capacity to be as flexible as I am now. You decided you were going to do a winter trip in your university holidays, and that was on these dates, and you went there, and you might have seen a mountain sometime in the 2 weeks, or you might not.
Do you have a favourite weather app at all, or just the BOM website?
Well, the two sites that I tend to look at, because they've worked for me, are the BOM site and a site called Ventusky.
Okay.
Ventusky, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, which is sort of a modelling site, which I find has been pretty good in terms of showing you up to a week ahead, how fronts might track and that sort of thing, at least in terms of precipitation, which is obviously a surrogate for all sorts of other things. I mean, it attempts to predict cloud cover and stuff as well, but that's not as accurate. But again, I always have to relate it to what I know of the landscape, and what it might be doing, and what might work and might not. Earlier this jump ahead. Oop, no, it's not there. Earlier this winter, I did a trip to Frenchman's Cap in Western Tasmania, and captured a couple of fantastic images that went into this book at the last minute. But I chose to go to Frenchman's because it looked like, from that weather modelling site, it would clear earlier than further southwest, which was my other possible destination, and might be better than the Central Highlands, which was going to get some easterly stuff later on, etc. So I do use it to make decisions about where I'm going to go, with potential photographs in mind. But you need to know what the places are like as well as I do to make it work.
Definitely.
This is amazing, unique, really. Well, it is unique place in the Walls of Jerusalem National Park on the Central Plateau of Tasmania. It's unique because these trees, pencil pines, are endemic to Tasmania. They grow nowhere else in the universe, and the forest in Dixon's kingdom here is probably the best developed in existence. So therefore, it's truly unique. And in winter, it's just an amazing to walk, or better in winter, snowshoe or ski around amongst these trees. It's sort of open woodland, really. And on this particular occasion, the snow had been falling and was still falling a little bit It's just quiet and still. No one else is there. Yeah, and so you just potter around, taking photographs all day, or not taking any photographs and just experiencing it.
It's an amazing place, Grant, and I've never been there. It's been really snowy, so thanks very much for showing that. It's just such a wonderful place. It's really spiritual, that forest. It's hard to describe just how wonderful it is, but this photo really does capture it. Actually, it's wonderful.
And actually, I'll just jump to this one first. This is the same place, or broadly speaking, the same place, the walls of Jerusalem, and probably only a few hundred meters from that previous photo. So, and just above the forest itself, the trees obviously become a bit smaller, a bit more wind pruned, and then above them are the Dolerite mountains that form the walls of Jerusalem themselves. So this was on a different trip. I've been into the walls many times in winter because it's just such a fantastic place, but also relatively speaking, it's pretty easy of access. I mean, in winter, of course, you know, you've got there's snow and you can fall, but with skis or snowshoes, it's easier than slogging into the Karakoram Range, for example. Yeah, so I just go in there and sit for a few days and wander around and see what's happening. But on this particular morning, I was camped down in the forest, probably the forest of the previous photo, and it looking up in the sort of pre-dawn as if it was a bit blue. So you sort of think, yes, it might clear. I mean, look like mist. You're in the cloud almost, or it's cloud above you, but it looked too blue to be very thick. So you go up and hope something might happen. I already knew about this composition from previous trips in both summer and a previous winter. So I'd sort of had in mind this idea, and I just went there and waited to see what happened. And it did get a bit thin just as the sun started lighting the cliffs, so hence the image. And this might be the last one. Yes, another example of the sorts of features that you get on the back of the nasty weather, nasty windy southwesterly or southerly weather that brings the snow and plasters shrubs, rocks with sort of rime ice like this. And this is on the edge of the Ben Lomond escarpment, so it's pretty exposed, fully exposed, in fact, to the blast of the southerlies, which is why it's so icy. But this stuff will only be there until the sun starts coming out, and then it won't exactly fall off immediately, but it loses its fine texture, which is what makes it fascinating. So to capture this, you've got to be there while it's still blowing, basically, and perched up on the escarpment in this freezing southerly, trying to both keep the camera steady on the tripod as well as retain feeling in your fingers was a bit of a challenge, but worthwhile in this instance, I think.
Absolutely.
So those and 83 other images, 89 in total, are in my new book, which is off being printed at the moment. But if anyone's particularly interested, I'd really like them to think about pre-ordering a copy at the site there. It's a sort of a crowdfunding platform, but I am doing it. It is going ahead. I'm just using the crowdfunding platform as a convenient platform to get orders. So yes, please consider buying a copy of my new book, and you'll have it in mid-November.
Brilliant. Just in time for Christmas.
Well, you'll have to come up for a cuppa and sign it for me, Grant.
Oh no, anyone who buys it, pre-order one, will get it signed by default.
Oh, there you go.
Fantastic.
Very good. Can't wait.
Is this your
Can't
first
wait.
book, Grant?
Yes, it is. Sort of. Well, I mean, I watched your session on books, however many episodes ago it was, and I think someone there talked about producing books as a legacy and such like. So I guess like many serious photographers, you sort of dream of producing your own book, especially as I've sort of grown up and evolved as a photographer through the era of Peter Dombrowski's publications and others of the Tasmanian wilderness genre. So I thought, yeah, I'd really like to produce a book, but it's just, never come together. But last year I decided, look, it's put up or shut up time, basically. So here it is.
Grant, just asking a bit more about it. So it's hardcover. It's what, close to 100 pages.
It's a hardcover. It's 30 by 24 centimeters. It's 120 pages.
120, yeah.
Nice paper, nice binding. It's sort of, I've tried to produce a book in the Tasmanian tradition of high quality fine art books. I haven't seen a physical one yet, so touch wood, it will be. But anyway, that's the idea, yes.
And where's the printing being done?
The printing is being done in China, which unfortunately or not, I mean, I would have liked to have done a local production just in terms of just the idea of producing things locally, but it just unfortunately isn't viable. But through a local print broker called Australian Book Connection, who's based in Melbourne, the book's been designed by a Tasmanian Hobart designer called Linda Warner, who I've worked with on a number of other projects over the years, which have involved other people's work. What else do you want to know?
I would tell us a little bit more about the foreword and the kind of background. There's a bit of exploration, I guess, also, and this is something that'd be nice to touch on. I think is how unique this body work is going to be in decades to come, relative to climate change and environmental shifts, and the fact that you as a person are in a unique position, and that you've been revisiting some of these landscapes over such a long period of time. You're probably one of the few people that could actually comment on the physical change that you might have actually witnessed. And I guess it'd be nice to let people know that's touched on in the book, or who else is kind of connected with it and added a bit of depth and backstory to the book.
Actually, thanks for the question, Paul. Yes, I mean, I decided to go with the subject matter because it's what I'm particularly into, but also because I decided I didn't really want to just produce another book of Tasmanian wilderness photos, although again, I did think about that, and it would be a nice thing to do, and I've certainly got lots of material from lots of other landscapes and parts of the state.
You make sure you do that.
But yes, I thought, if this is the first one, and it may or may not be the only one, then I'll do the thing that I'm really into. So that's how it had its origins, and obviously it's something that. As Paul said, I'd like to think my body of work on Tasmanian winter landscapes is pretty comprehensive, and perhaps more comprehensive than most out there. So I've got something that no one else has got, so I might as well present it. In terms of the winter landscape in Tasmania, as I was explaining, in terms of the practicalities of getting there and seeing these sorts of conditions, it's pretty fleeting. The snow comes and goes pretty quickly. The weather changes. Some winters you might get none at all, virtually. So over the short term, the decades that I've been experiencing, four decades I've been experiencing the Tasmanian mountains, I've seen sort of snow-free winters and particularly snowy ones. But if you look at the data, and certainly if you look at studies on mainland Australia in the Australian Alps in New South Wales, there's pretty strong evidence that there's a trend towards decreasing snowfalls, snowpack over winters, and that's not surprising. It fits with the story of climate change modelling and such like. So there's a very real possibility that these sort of landscapes in Tasmania are not going to be there for much longer, and the ecological implications of that are quite significant, because a lot of this vegetation is adapted to seasonal snow cover, especially the stuff that the so-called snow patch vegetation, which sits at the bottom of cliffs where the snow lies longest, etc., etc. And quite apart from snow, warming and drying climate, which is the predictions for parts of Western Tasmania, are going to drive alpine vegetation and things like those pencil pine forests at the walls of Jerusalem upwards, altitudinally, and they can't move very fast. Maybe they can't move fast enough at all. And there's some of them are pretty close to the tops of mountains anyway. So, ultimately that means potentially that we're going to lose that as well. So it's all, it's a serious worry. So I guess in that sense, maybe if people have still got my book in 50 years' time, it'll be a historical artifact. But I'd like to think that we might turn things around before that becomes the case. But I can't say I'm an optimist on that subject at the moment.
Who else has written in the book, Grant?
I got apart from a foreword by a friend called David Nielsen, who is a photographer and writer from Melbourne, who I got to know through my through my involvement with the Australian Conservation Foundation in the 1980s. But I'd read about his stuff long before that, because he's got many similar interests to me. He's travelled in Patagonia, he's climbed in Tasmania, he was on first ascents of the big faces at Frenchman's Cap and Federation Peak, all of which I read stories of avidly in the 1970s. And got to know him as a friend over 3 decades. So he wrote my foreword, but the rest of the book, it has basically just 3 short essays by me on some of the stuff I've talked about tonight, I guess. What's the attraction of these places and why I do it. A bit about the natural history and the risks of climate change, and a bit about the capturing of images, the practical aspects of getting there and staying alive long enough to capture photographs.
Yeah, that's the last part you don't get to see in the pictures. Yeah, they're staying alive long enough. When I look at some of those crevasses and some of those icy slopes and over 7,000 meter ascents and convincing your friends to do a bivvy just to get an early shot, I don't think people really understand what you're asking of, say, your mate to do that. But I've got an inkling of an idea at least, and it's been amazing just seeing you go strength to strength. I did try and wave at you the other day from out of a plane, which I know you're quite annoyed by, but that was easily my most enjoyable experience of the Duquesne Range. And snow was flying over the top of it. And Lukey did the same, so it's not just one of us.
I was just going to ask Grant a question around his post-processing, and I sort of find your work remarkably consistent over time. And of course, you've had many different camera systems over that time. And so have you really found it hard in some ways to maintain that consistency with post-processing, or do you do quite a bit of work? I mean, your work seems very true to life, and so perhaps there's not quite so much done there?
It's interesting you should say that you think it looks consistent. I guess I certainly view myself philosophically as a documentary or naturalistic type photographer. I like to think that I represent images as they were, so to speak. Of course, bearing in mind, of course, that nothing's truly as it were. It's always filtered by technology, as well as how you feel when you're playing with the sliders and things. And of course, in the film days, it was influenced by what film you chose and all that sort of thing. I mean, that's what I like doing, and it sort of fits with why I'm out there and all that sort of stuff. But I do feel, if I look back on my early digital images, which is really, prior to digital, of course, it was slide film. So you captured it, you had a choice of film, but once you got it back, that was it basically. That's it. But with digital, of course, anything goes, or there's the potential for anything goes. So, but looking back at my images processed from the early digital days, 2006-7 to ones now, I certainly feel like I'm on the slippery slope, as my New South Wales photographer mate that I go to New Zealand with, Ian Brown, would say. The current versions are, I think, noticeably more saturated, more contrasty than those early stuff. And I look at the early stuff and think, well, maybe I could go back and reprocess them, and they would feel better. So I have these debates with myself from time to time. But in general, I don't do very much to my images, other than tweaking in the raw file, really. Very little Photoshop work, apart from focus stacking, which I've embraced as a technique in recent years as essentially a way around, the limitations of lenses.
I was going to ask you that
Did you
actually.
get,
Even
did you
that
get
image
contacted by
behind
Rob?
you there is very clearly must have had a focus stack or something done to it just to maintain that level of detail across the frame.
Yeah, I mean, many of them would be, sometimes there are only 2 frames combined, maybe 3. I rarely use more than 4. It starts getting a bit more technically challenging, or not so much technically challenging, but time consuming. The amount of time that focus stacking can take up if you want to be pernickety, pixel peep, especially if there's foliage and stuff involved, can be
And there's
a
wind.
great time waster.
Yeah,
You need to get a new Canon R5 because there's no nitpicking on that one. It's a piece of cake.
Right, yes.
Just go pop, 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 pop with your finger on the screen and it's done. So, Grant, who would you describe as some of your influences? Like when you talk about focus stacking, my first thought is, did you get that off Rob? Or did you take that one yourself?
No, it was probably mainly, I heard about it. I can't remember who I talked to about it first. Possibly Chris Bell, actually.
Okay.
But yes, and I talked to Robman, the local grandfather wilderness photographers.
Don't repeat that one.
I mean, we all live near each other. We've all known each other for a long time. We all have a background in the conservation movement and the Franklin campaign. So yes, I can't remember who might have talked about it first. I tried a couple of different pieces of software before I settled on using one, but I think Rob uses something else. Yeah.
But in the bigger picture, and this is probably a longer question, but who would you describe as your influences? Did you know Peter, for instance? Did you actually meet him and spend time with him? Or
Yeah, I did meet Peter. Knew him. And
that's for everyone else. That's Peter Dromboskis.
Peter Dromboskis, yes. And I didn't spend a lot of time with him. Peter was a very sort of
elusive character.
Well, sort of solitary character. But yes, I met and talked to Peter a bit. And was in fact one of a number of photographers who were on the search for what became his body, unfortunately, back in 1996. But before that, I guess in terms of my early interest in mountains and mountain photography, one guy who I was always drawn to the photos of, and I've got most of his books on my bookshelf here, was Galen Rao. Who did and a number of the areas that I visited in Pakistan and the like are places that he visited and wrote about and I saw photographs of before.
It's quite interesting you say that, Grant, because on YouTube someone's referred to you as the Galen Rowell of Australian photographers. So there you go.
Oh, I don't know about that. I think that's a bit of a stretch. But I had the privilege of meeting Galen as well because he came to Tasmania. His one and only visit here. He was brought here by some guys who there was one of those, I think, National Photographic Society conventions in Hobart. I think it might have been 1996. He was, he might have been in Australia, I don't know, but anyway, he was brought to Tasmania as a guest speaker. And one of the keen photographers in one of the clubs worked for Parks and Wildlife, and I was working there at the time, and he organised to take him into the bush for a couple of days to Pine Valley and asked me to come along and help. So I got to go on a 3-day bushwalk to Pine Valley with Galen Rao, which was fantastic. Unfortunately, I think it was the following year that he died in a plane crash in California. But he was a bit like Peter, actually, a very sort of quiet, unassuming character, despite having done all these obviously amazing things. So, apart from him, I don't know, no real name springs to mind. I've sort of got a collection of photographic books on my bookshelf, as I imagine most of the rest of you have, and bits from here, bits from there. I guess it would be hard to say that someone like Peter Dombrowski's is not an influence, and certainly over any photographer who has lived in and operated in Tasmania through the period that I have. I don't think of that consciously. He's just there. You go to places and you see these Peter Dombrowski's photos.
And I guess big question. The other thing that people aren't necessarily aware of, but somebody actually mentioned it in the comments, is you've been heavily involved in producing amazing calendars for, I don't know, decades. I would assume, long time. And so even though it's your first book, you've been involved in a lot of collaborative projects, and even collaborative book projects as well.
Yeah, well, that's right. Yes, I mean, my images have certainly appeared in a range of books, both in Tasmania and sort of overseas through my image library stuff. But the Tasmanian stuff has sort of basically been productions associated with promoting, the good management and conservation of the wild Tasmanian landscape. Sort of publications from the Wilderness Society and the Australian Conservation Foundation, as well as sort of private ones. And the calendar you mentioned, yes, that's that started as a Rob Blaker's initiative, and I got involved, I think, a year or two after he'd been doing it with, in the early days, Dennis Harding, but for a long time, 15 plus years, it's been basically just Rob and myself producing a calendar we call Wild Tasmania, which is basically a shared production across the board. Half the images are mine, half are his. We share the cost and try and sell enough to make it worthwhile year by year. This year's is sort of out in the shops now.
Yeah, it's always been a milestone for me, that one, Grant. Like every year I spend time with it and reflect on it, and I think about that kind of curation process you guys must go through, and how many of those are targeted kind of gaps maybe that you're trying to accomplish. I know Rob's a little bit like that. He's very targeted and wants a shot, and he'll shoot out in like a 24-hour, 48 period just to get it. And I guess he's probably got a fairly big. He's got those extra sheds out the back of his house for a reason, I guess, over the years.
Yeah, well, that's right. I guess, or the other thing I should say about the calendar, because it's quite different to the production process that I've just gone through with the book, is that from the very beginning, we've wanted it to be a local product. So it is entirely produced in Tasmania, printed, everything's done here. And that means that the whole package is more expensive to produce, but it's more satisfying, and it's sort of green, environmentally friendly inks and FSC paper and the like. So it fits with sort of our philosophy. We probably don't make as much of that as we could, but and we like to think it's sort of the premium product in the calendar market in Tasmania, carrying on the Dombrowski's tradition, if you like. Certainly in terms of the size of it and what we're aiming for. That's sort of where the idea comes from.
How are you finding the market for calendars? Is it drying up or?
Oh yes, it's declined, but it's declined to a low but stable level. Touch wood, at least up until this summer. It's a long way from the heyday of when Peter was producing his calendar, but of course that was also on the back of things like the Franklin campaign. So there was both a profile for the product, as well as probably a lot of people who were involved in that sort of stuff still wanting to buy his calendar every year. But now, of course, I suspect the number of people who actually make use of calendars for their intended practical purpose is substantially less, with digital devices that tell you everything. I still have a calendar hanging on my wall with the right things on, because it just suits the way I operate. But anyway, touch wood, it's out there again this year, and hopefully enough will sell that we'll decide to do it again next year.
And you must your calendar must get pretty full with ideas and maybe trips that you're planning down the track. And perhaps when things open up, do you have any places that you'd like to still check out, or is it that's the sort of cards held closer to the chest kind of thing?
No. I've got I've got a long list of places I'd like to visit. Life isn't long enough to visit everywhere you'd like to visit, and I guess we've all been very privileged to live through an era where long distance travel has been affordable, basically. But that might be about to change. Who knows? But there's still lots of nice places close to home. And notwithstanding that I've been busy this year producing the book and such like, I've got out several times through the winter and in the got plans for early this summer, all revolving around Tasmania, because I don't expect to be going anywhere else for any time soon. And as for overseas destinations, they partly evolve related to sort of opportunities, because many of the things I'd like to do in those places involve a need for someone else to be with, practical reasons as much as social ones. And therefore, if something comes up that someone's doing that they might be looking for a companion, then that'll become the trip. That's how my Arctic trips came about. For example, in the first one in 2003, which is when I took that photo of Mount Asgard and Baffin Island. The Canadian guy and his wife, who subsequently become good friends, they were friends of a friend of mine, and they were just putting a trip together and looking for people. And I thought, gee, I've never been there, and it'd be good to go with someone who knew a bit about the place. So be it. So who knows? Yeah. However, we've also, my New South Wales mate Ian and I have got this, had this long-term partnership now, 10 years of doing these long trips in New Zealand, and so there's a lot more ideas there. He didn't get there last summer, so I went by myself and did something else. We were hoping to make it across this summer, but we'll see. So if there's an opportunity to go to New Zealand late this summer, that might be the first trip outside Tasmania to revisit another part of Fiordland, for example.
Well, they are talking about that travel bubble, so hopefully that might come to fruition.
Yeah, I'm hoping the same, Grant.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if there is a trip going to Macquarie Island, just make sure you give Nick a tap on the shoulder as well. I'm sure he'll appreciate it.
Well, practically speaking, I mean, really the only way you can get to Macquarie Island is either be employed by the land manager or go on a cruise, which really doesn't give you much of an experience of Macquarie Island. I mean, back in the day, Peter Dombrowski's and Jeff Lee went to Macquarie Island in the 1980s on a chartered yacht, which is pretty out there. I at least sailed down on the Aurora Australis, but I'm not sure that would be possible now. It's a strict nature reserve basically, and they are trying to manage it to keep out nasty things, especially having had such amazing success getting rid of all the feral animals in the last 15-20 years. You don't want to go backwards.
No, that's exactly right, and I think it's I think the only realistic way for a photographer to get down there now that's not employed would be some form of arts grant or sort of that sort of thing. I don't think I've got the skills that they need down at Macquarie Island, apart from take a few nice photos, but other than that, I'm not an electrician. I'm not a wildlife monitor. I'm not a ranger. So
let's hope that I think, you don't have to go down there because of some other more employment-based reasons.
Yeah, I mean,
if I did, there'd be some issues, I think. But thankfully,
the Antarctic Division, Federal Antarctic Division, does have what they now call a arts fellowship, I think. Back in the day, it was called the Humanities Program, and that is in fact how I visited Antarctica for the first time in 1998-99. And I was successful there after several years of trying. I think partly because of my sort of combination of skills, being able to look after myself in that sort of environment, as well as being an earth scientist. So I went down largely to contribute to and photograph their science program, and of course had spare time around that, which was amazing. And Macquarie Island, as I said, I was an employee of the Park Service doing another project, nothing to do with photography. But yes, those arts fellowships for the Antarctic Division are still running. I don't know what the criteria are now and how strict it would be, but I don't think Macquarie Island's an option under them. It's about the continent and the national government managed bases, not Macquarie, which is a Tasmanian thing, even though the Antarctic Division basically supports it. and the base there is in Antarctic Division Base. The land manager is the Park Service and the Tasmanian government, so they dictate who goes and what they can do.
Grant, we're getting sort of close to the end of the show, but something I wanted to touch on that might maybe just ripple a bit of flavour of inspiration around for all our sort of audiences is where and how do you see kind of the role of photography in conservation and environmental issues in modern times and moving into the future? I mean, you've been using it and actively part of using it for longer than pretty much all of us put together. But you know, if you've got, you know, but we're all in the same boat, so to speak, and we're all photographers here on the show, and I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts, maybe personally for yourself, and maybe touch on where or how you see that role has evolved or changed or moving to in the future, or just what we can do right now.
Yeah, well, I mean, whilst I've had a long personal involvement in the conservation movement, and my photographs have been used for conservation campaigns, I haven't really been as active as a photographer in that as some. Rob Blakers, for example, who I think talked on exactly that subject some time ago. But I mean, as Rob probably said, and I guess it's intuitively obvious, I mean, photography has clearly had it's been a crucial component of almost any land management related conservation campaign you can think of. You know, how do you argue for the protection of a place if you can't show people what it looks like? What I'm sort of, I guess, I'm a bit concerned about in the modern era is photography now seems to me to have become rather devalued compared to what it was before, because there's so much imagery out there, and it's so easy, seemingly, to capture, and also related to that, and it's more the digital era than before, I guess. There's a lack of trust, perhaps, in the accuracy or the veracity of imagery, which could, in the long term, influence, you know, whether people really think what they're looking at is real, and if they don't trust it, you know, what does that mean? You know, I'm talking about things like, you know, photoshopping in the colloquial use of the term, etc., but you know, all sorts of other stuff. And the other sort of aspect of, I guess, modern internet-related photography, I guess, that doesn't sort of appeal to me is is the sort of the acquisitive nature, I guess, of image capture and people chasing their versions of images that have been posted by someone else. I mean, that's been going on for a long time as well, I guess. You know, from what I understand, you've been able to do, you know, tours in the States to all the famous Ansel Adams sites and take your own version for decades. But I mean, it's a question of degree, I guess, and there's plenty of examples, even in Tasmania, of places that have been, you know, discovered on Instagram and then are now physically impacted or even trashed. So what to do about that? Well, it's basically about everyone taking personal responsibility, really, for both the capturing of it. Well, you capture any image you like, but what you then do with it. And if you're going to post it, you're essentially promoting a place. And what are the implications of that? They can be positive if you're trying to get it protected, but it might just be protected in the short term and then trashed in another way later. So what have we gained? So there's a lot of sort of philosophical issues, but ultimately I think it just comes down to personal responsibility across the board, and there seems to be a lack of that across the board, especially by some of our societal leaders these days, which is not a good general message.
It's a very good point, Grant, and very much a philosophical one, because we all contribute somewhat to sharing and promoting these places, and I think you're right. We just have to be careful about how we message things, how we describe things, how we name things, and take that responsibility on board. I mean, we go out there to capture these beautiful places, and we want to show people these places that we've caught. But then, you know, are we contributing to their demise? It's a question that you know, I think we probably know the answer to, but it's very difficult for us to control or stop now in this digital age and Instagram age.
That's right.
And, something we really have to think about for the future.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, the other aspect of it from a personal perspective too, and I like to think that, I mean, I'm not unique, so therefore maybe there are other people out there who think similarly. As I said at the beginning, I go to these places because I like being in the places, and capturing the photographic capture is sort of part of being there for me. I mean, flying over it in a plane, for example, and taking photos of the Karakoram Range just wouldn't cut it. I have to be on the ground and experiencing it to both for the image to be meaningful for me and to be worth capturing. And a component of that greater experience of wild places generally is mystery. And if you go to a place knowing, having read a detailed guidebook, you might follow the breadcrumb trail that someone's posted from a previous trip on your GPS, and you've seen 500 images taken there in a range of conditions, etc. I mean, okay, you can go there and see those things, but it's not the same. It's not, the experience is different, and it doesn't do it for me. So whilst when I'm planning travel to interesting places I haven't been to, obviously you chase some information to work out the practicalities of how to get there and where you might go, etc. But I don't consciously go and search out vast amounts of information, look at lots and lots of photos beyond sort of basic ones that might tell me about the landscape, because I want to discover it for myself. So yeah, again, in the digital age, it's about more and more information just ultimately reduces the opportunities for those sorts of experiences for people in the future, and I think that would be a great loss.
I think you're one of a certain breed, Grant, that some of us are, and I think there's definitely another breed that just want all the information handed to them on a plate and just want to go and experience exactly what they've seen already in a picture. And I don't know how we change that. I don't think we can. It's human nature to a degree. But I certainly align myself, and I know most people watching this would, with your philosophies, that the mystery is, and the sense of you might see something that you haven't seen before is really, and being in the place and experiencing the place for what it is, not what it is on the screen. I think that really is the philosophy that we need to push forward, and it's one I'm fairly vocal about at times on the internet, and yeah. Anyway, I'm really pleased that you brought that up, actually.
Yeah, I guess I'd argue, just picking up on one of your points, that if all you're doing is being plonked in a place, perhaps by some mechanical contraption, and taking a photograph and then leaving, you're not experiencing it. So maybe that's enough for some people. I mean, you've probably all seen maybe, and or certainly read about, the experience of in more highly developed tourist areas of people jumping out of the car, taking a snap of the landscape, jumping in and driving off because they can look at the photo at home and see what they saw, sort of thing. It's just that. Anyway, it's certainly not me, obviously, and it's so different to what I think is so good that I pursue, that I think if more people realise what they're missing, then they wouldn't operate that way. But I don't know, maybe that's naive.
I think a lot of people enjoy their comfort, and the idea of being uncomfortable to see these things is probably goes beyond their limits, whereas if they just pushed themselves a little bit further, they wouldn't really know what they were capable of. So I often feel that. It's certainly my experience, because I never thought I'd want to go out and see these places. So yeah, I think that there's a big part of that as well.
Maybe we're just getting soft, Grant, because I know when I think about what you do and when I bump into you when I do, I just feel soft because that's, like I said, I wasn't joking when I talked about that element of steel, because you cannot do what you do without some aspect of resolve and drive to be out in those brutal, harsh conditions and pushing yourself out of bed on those, below freezing mornings into those horrendously wet conditions and frozen boots. And, it's just not many people just have the drive to do that, Grant. And I think it's partly why your work sort of stands alone, because almost single-handedly you've done that just about more than anyone in the state, and various places around the world. So as much as it's normal to you, it's the other end of the known universe to probably most of us. But that also is what makes your work so special, and why I really think people should, honor what you do by investing it. And I think we've already had a few sales while the show's been going, Grant, so that's a good sign.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Well, on that note, I think we've probably hit our time, and unless there's I don't think there's any further questions on the chat, so we'll have to thank Grant so much for his time joining us tonight. I've certainly got a lot out of it. I'm sure everybody has, and I guess hopefully we can have you back on some point down the track too, if you'd be open to that, because you've got so much knowledge and information and amazing pictures to share, so that would be brilliant. So great. Anything to add, guys?
Well, I'm just really glad we finished on that element. It was something I was really hoping to explore with you, Grant. I think we're all had that on our minds when we were thinking of having you on the show, and as much as we didn't showcase it, it was really nice to sort of naturally foray into that, because I think you're in a very unique position to comment on some of those things, I think, and they're very, very important things to dwell on for all of us on the show, all of us to take photographs, all of us to use social media, and all of us to have a love and a passion for natural places. I'm just really glad we spent a bit of time with that.
Brilliant.
Well, thank you guys for having me on, and for organising this and keeping it going from beyond the COVID lockdown that it started in. It's been great.
Thanks so much,
been
Grant.
good.
Thanks for coming, mate. And everyone, get on there and order a copy of Grant's book. I can absolutely guarantee that you won't be disappointed.
It'll be a great Christmas present.
Great Christmas present, but make sure you get one for yourself. So buy two. That's the message. At least two.
At least two.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Thanks again, and we'll see you same time next week. And thanks again, Grant. We'll catch you later.
See you around the neighbourhood, Grant.
Bye.
Bye.